I watched our shells strike the ridge and felt the tunnels answer back. The orders said armor would be enough, but the ground kept swallowing our work. I committed the flame, knowing the system had not asked for it, and my crew would pay the price if I was wrong. When the ridge finally went quiet, the silence did not feel like permission. On 19 February 1945, United States Marine Corps assault units began landing on the island of Iwo Jima, a volcanic outcrop in the Central Pacific, roughly 750 miles south of Tokyo. The island measured little more than 8 square miles. Despite its size, it had been turned into a fortified defensive position by the Imperial Japanese Army over the course of nearly a year. By the morning of the landings, Iwo Jima was already isolated, cut off from reinforcement and resupply, but it remained heavily garrisoned and prepared for prolonged resistance. Operational control of the island's defense rested with Lieutenant General Kuribayashi Tadamichi. Kuribayashi had rejected the doctrine of defending the beaches. Instead, he ordered an extensive system of tunnels, caves, reinforced bunkers, and underground command posts dug into the volcanic rock. These positions were mutually supporting, concealed, and designed to survive heavy bombardment. The defenders were instructed to avoid banzai charges and instead fight a war of attrition, inflicting maximum casualties while remaining hidden for as long as possible. By the time the landing craft reached the beaches, naval gunfire and aerial bombing had already been applied for days. Observers aboard ships offshore believed that the bombardment had neutralized much of the island's defenses. That assumption proved incorrect within minutes of the first waves coming ashore. As Marines struggled through soft volcanic ash, Japanese positions opened fire from concealed apertures farther inland. The beachhead rapidly became congested with men, equipment, and damaged vehicles. Among the American units assigned to the operation was the 4th Marine Tank Battalion, equipped primarily with M4 Sherman medium tanks. These tanks were intended to provide direct fire support to infantry units as they advanced inland. The Shermans carried a 75mm main gun and machine guns, weapons effective against exposed positions but limited against deeply entrenched fortifications. The volcanic terrain further complicated their employment. The ash reduced traction, clogged engines, and made maneuvering difficult. Attached to the tank battalion were a small number of modified vehicles officially designated as flamethrower tanks. These were standard M4 Shermans that had been altered to replace the main gun with a flame projector. The most common variant used at Iwo Jima was the M4A3R3, equipped with a Navy Mark I flamethrower system. Fuel was stored in internal tanks, pressurized with compressed gas, and expelled through the projector in bursts that could reach over 100 yards under ideal conditions. At the time of the landings, these flamethrower tanks were not considered the primary solution to the island's defenses. They were viewed as specialized assets, useful in limited circumstances, but vulnerable and mechanically complex. Many Marine infantry officers had limited experience working alongside them. Tank crews themselves were still refining tactics for their use in close coordination with infantry. One of these crews belonged to a platoon operating under the battalion's Company C. The platoon leader, a junior officer with previous combat experience in the Marshall Islands, had been assigned to oversee several standard Shermans and one flamethrower-equipped tank. His role involved coordinating movement, maintaining communication with infantry commanders, and identifying targets that armored fire could reasonably address. During the first hours of the assault, tank crews waited offshore, engines running while landing craft were cleared. When they finally came ashore, many found the beach choked with wrecked vehicles and casualties. Several tanks became immobilized almost immediately after leaving the ramps, bogged down in ash or damaged by artillery fire that had survived the bombardment. The flamethrower tank in the platoon landed later than planned. Its crew consisted of a driver, assistant driver, flame operator, and tank commander. The crew had trained together for months, but had never used the flamethrower in combat against a fortified enemy. Their instructions emphasized caution. The tank's armor was no thicker than that of a standard Sherman, and its specialized role meant it often had to approach enemy positions more closely than gun tanks. As the Marines pushed inland during the afternoon of 19 February, it became clear that Japanese defenses were largely intact. Pillboxes were camouflaged, slits barely visible. Mortar and artillery fire was coordinated through buried observation posts. Infantry assaults on individual positions often resulted in heavy casualties before the defenders could be neutralized. Tank fire was called in repeatedly to reduce these strongpoints. High explosive shells were fired directly into cave mouths and bunker openings. In some cases, this suppressed fire temporarily. In many others, Japanese troops simply withdrew deeper into the tunnel systems, re-emerging after the tanks moved on. The limitations of conventional tank armament against subterranean defenses became increasingly apparent as the day wore on. Japanese soldiers observing these engagements took careful note. From within their underground positions, they could hear tank engines approaching, feel the shock of impacts against reinforced concrete, and wait for the fire to lift. Their doctrine emphasized patience and concealment. As long as positions remained intact, they could continue to resist. The flamethrower tank was initially held back, committed only when infantry officers identified a particularly stubborn position. When it was finally ordered forward, the terrain forced it to move slowly. The crew advanced behind a screen of riflemen who marked suspected cave entrances with smoke or hand signals. The tank commander relied on these cues, since visibility from inside the vehicle was limited. When the flamethrower was first discharged in combat, its effect was immediate but localized. A burst of flame was directed into a shallow cave opening on a low ridge. The fire burned for several seconds, then ceased. Infantry moved forward cautiously afterward. In this instance, the position was found abandoned, its defenders either killed or withdrawn deeper into the hill. The result was noted, but it did not yet alter overall tactics. Throughout the rest of the day and into 20th February, the same pattern repeated across the island. Infantry assaults encountered concealed fire. Tanks provided support but could not decisively eliminate underground resistance. Casualty figures mounted steadily. Progress inland was measured in yards rather than miles. From the Japanese perspective, the appearance of flame weapons was not entirely unexpected. Flamethrowers had been encountered earlier in the Pacific War, though usually in man-portable form. The tank-mounted variant, however, presented a different challenge. Its range exceeded that of individual flamethrower operators, and its fuel supply allowed for repeated use. Still, Japanese defenders initially regarded it as another threat to be endured through discipline and fortification. By the end of the second day, American commanders were reassessing their assumptions. The naval bombardment had not neutralized the defenses. Standard tank fire was insufficient against deeply buried positions. Infantry losses were high, and morale was strained by the slow pace of advance. Within the tank battalion, officers began discussing the flamethrower tanks more frequently. Reports circulated of caves cleared more effectively by flame than by shell fire. At the same time, concerns remained about vulnerability. Several tanks had already been knocked out by mines or artillery, and flamethrower tanks, with their distinctive equipment, were high-value targets. The platoon leader noted these discussions during brief pauses between movements. His attention was divided between maintaining his vehicles and responding to infantry requests. The flamethrower tank remained operational, but its crew showed signs of strain. The work required close approach under fire, precise coordination, and constant awareness of mechanical limitations. As night fell on 20th February, both sides prepared for continued fighting. Japanese units adjusted their firing plans and reinforced tunnel connections. American units consolidated their gains, treated wounded, and brought forward supplies. The flamethrower tanks were refueled and inspected, their crews resting in shifts near their vehicles. At this stage of the battle, the presence of flamethrower tanks was peripheral rather than central. They had demonstrated potential, but had not yet been fully integrated into the broader assault strategy. The operational problem remained unresolved: how to break a defense designed specifically to survive bombardment and frontal assault.
The stage was set for further experimentation, adaptation, and hard decisions, driven not by doctrine alone, but by conditions on the ground.
By 21 February 1945, the American advance on Iwo Jima had slowed across nearly every sector. The initial beachhead had expanded inland, but gains were uneven and costly. Terrain that appeared open on maps was, in practice, broken by ridges, ravines, and volcanic outcrops riddled with concealed firing positions. Japanese resistance remained organized and deliberate, coordinated through tunnel networks that allowed defenders to shift forces without exposing themselves above ground. Marine infantry regiments reported similar patterns of contact. Positions thought cleared reactivated after attackers moved past. Mortar fire appeared suddenly from slopes that had been traversed hours earlier. Casualty evacuation routes were frequently brought under fire by defenders emerging from unseen apertures. The operational assumption that resistance would collapse after the loss of forward positions proved incorrect. Tank support continued to be requested, but the limits of conventional armor were becoming increasingly visible. Standard Sherman tanks could suppress known bunkers when firing directly into apertures, but identifying those apertures remained difficult. Japanese defenders had learned to disguise openings with debris or removable panels. Even when hits were accurate, reinforced concrete and earth absorbed much of the blast. Tanks were also vulnerable to close-range attack. Mines buried in ash disabled tracks. Artillery observers concealed in elevated positions directed fire onto predictable armor approaches. Within the 4th Marine Tank Battalion, maintenance crews worked continuously to keep vehicles operational. The volcanic ash infiltrated engines, transmissions, and fuel systems. Tracks required constant adjustment. Flamethrower tanks demanded additional attention as their fuel lines and pressurization systems were sensitive to damage and contamination. Any mechanical failure in these vehicles removed a scarce asset from the battlefield. Infantry officers increasingly requested flamethrower support for specific targets. Reports indicated that flame could reach into cave systems beyond the immediate entrance, consuming oxygen and forcing defenders to withdraw or succumb. These effects, however, depended on precise placement and sustained application. A short burst into a shallow cave was effective. Deeper tunnel networks required repeated exposure, often under fire. Despite these reports, flamethrower tanks were not yet employed systematically. Battalion-level plans still emphasized combined infantry tank advances using standard firepower. Flamethrower vehicles were assigned reactively, dispatched to problem areas rather than integrated into the initial assault sequence. This reflected both caution and institutional uncertainty. Flame weapons were specialized, and their use carried risks, including the possibility of catastrophic damage if fuel systems were struck. Japanese defenders adapted to their appearance. Observation posts noted the distinctive profile of flamethrower tanks, particularly the absence of a standard gun barrel. These vehicles were prioritized for engagement when possible. Anti-tank teams waited for them to approach within range, attempting to disable them before they could deliver sustained fire. Even when these attempts failed, the threat forced flamethrower crews to operate under intense pressure. On several occasions during 21 and 22 February, flamethrower tanks were called forward to assist stalled infantry attacks. In some cases, they achieved local success, neutralizing positions that had resisted repeated shelling. In others, they were driven back by artillery or forced to withdraw due to mechanical issues. The inconsistency of results reinforced existing doubts among some commanders. The platoon leader overseeing Company C's vehicles recorded these engagements through reports and after-action discussions. He noted that flamethrower tanks were most effective when infantry were able to identify cave systems accurately and provide close protection. When used in isolation or without clear targeting, their impact was limited. He also observed that once a flamethrower tank was withdrawn, Japanese defenders sometimes reoccupied the position if the tunnel system remained intact.
Japanese command elements continued to rely on discipline and preparation rather than counterattack. Kuribaishi's orders emphasized survival and endurance. Soldiers were instructed to avoid wasteful engagements and to conserve strength for prolonged resistance. Flamethrower attacks were met with temporary withdrawal rather than immediate counterfire when possible. Defenders retreated deeper into tunnels, sealing entrances behind them or emerging from secondary exits once the danger passed. This pattern frustrated American units attempting to secure terrain permanently. Clearing a cave entrance did not guarantee control of the position. Engineers attempted to seal openings with explosives, but the number of entrances and the complexity of the tunnel networks made comprehensive demolition difficult. Flame was effective in denying specific spaces, but it did not always collapse the surrounding structure. By 23 February, the operational picture showed a widening gap between expectations and reality. Official planning documents had anticipated a rapid advance supported by overwhelming firepower. Instead, progress depended on reducing hundreds of individual strongpoints, each requiring time, coordination, and often multiple attempts. Infantry fatigue was evident, casualty lists grew longer, and unit rotations became more frequent. Commanders at regimental and divisional levels began to reconsider their approach. Requests for flamethrower tanks increased. Reports from units that had employed them successfully were circulated. Still, hesitation remained. Some officers questioned whether reliance on flame weapons aligned with established doctrine or posed unacceptable risks to crews. Within the tank battalion, discussions reflected this tension. Maintenance officers warned that increased use would accelerate wear and increase the likelihood of breakdowns. Medical officers noted the psychological strain on flamethrower crews who were aware of the particular danger they faced. Infantry officers, on the other hand, emphasized the reduction in casualties when stubborn positions were cleared more quickly. The platoon leader found himself balancing these perspectives. He was responsible for the welfare of his crews and the readiness of his vehicles, but he also received urgent requests from infantry commanders facing entrenched resistance. Each decision to commit the flamethrower tank involved weighing potential gains against known risks. Japanese observers continued to assess American tactics. They recognized that flame attacks were being used selectively and that their appearance often signaled an attempt to resolve a stalled advance. Defensive plans adjusted accordingly. Some tunnel systems were modified to include deeper chambers and angled passages to reduce the penetration of flame. Others incorporated secondary exits farther from likely approach routes. Despite these adaptations, the cumulative effect of flamethrower use began to register. Positions subjected to repeated flame attacks became untenable over time. Oxygen depletion, heat, and the destruction of supplies forced defenders to abandon some areas permanently. These outcomes were noted by both sides, even if they did not yet dominate the battlefield. As February drew to a close, the battle entered a phase of attritional grinding. Every yard gained required deliberate effort. Flamethrower tanks were no longer a novelty, but neither were they a standard solution. Their role remained contested, shaped by operational necessity rather than formal endorsement. The unresolved question facing American commanders was whether to continue treating flamethrower tanks as supplementary assets or to elevate them into a central role against the island's defenses. The answer had implications not only for tactics, but for doctrine, resource allocation, and the acceptance of risk. For the platoon leader and his crews, these debates translated into daily decisions made under fire with limited guidance beyond immediate necessity. The limits of existing approaches were increasingly apparent, and the pressure to adapt grew with each costly engagement.
By the final days of February 1945, the battle for Iwo Jima had entered a phase defined less by movement and more by reduction. American forces were no longer advancing along broad fronts. Instead, progress consisted of isolating, attacking, and neutralizing individual defensive complexes embedded in the island's ridges and draws. Each position required deliberate coordination between infantry, engineers, artillery, and armor. The terrain amplified the difficulty. Volcanic rock resisted demolition charges, while ash-filled depressions concealed tunnel exits that could not be identified from above. Aerial reconnaissance offered limited assistance, as many Japanese positions were fully subterranean. Maps were revised daily as new cave systems were discovered, often only after they had been engaged. In this environment, the effectiveness of conventional approaches continued to decline. Infantry assaults, unsupported by specialized weapons, resulted in heavy casualties. Artillery and naval gunfire, though still used, could not be applied with the precision needed to collapse deeply buried defenses without endangering friendly troops. Tank gunfire remained useful against exposed apertures, but failed to produce lasting results against interconnected tunnels. Reports from the field increasingly emphasized the same conclusion. Positions subjected to sustained flame attacks were more likely to be permanently neutralized. Infantry units noted fewer instances of reoccupation after flamethrower tanks had been employed thoroughly. Engineers observed that heat damage inside tunnel systems often rendered them structurally unstable or uninhabitable, even when entrances remained intact. These observations did not originate from a single command directive. They emerged gradually through after-action reports, informal briefings, and conversations between officers operating under similar conditions. The accumulation of such evidence began to influence decision-making at lower levels, even before formal doctrine adjusted. Within Company C of the 4th Marine Tank Battalion, the platoon leader found himself increasingly relied upon for assessments related to flame employment. Infantry officers began requesting his presence during planning discussions, seeking advice on when and how the flamethrower tank might be used most effectively. This marked a shift from earlier days when the vehicle had been treated as a supplementary asset, deployed only after other methods failed. The platoon leader's perspective was shaped by direct observation rather than theory. He had seen standard tanks expend large quantities of ammunition against positions that remained active hours later. He had also witnessed flame attacks that produced immediate and sustained results, provided they were applied deliberately and protected by infantry. At the same time, he was aware of the costs. Flamethrower tanks operated at close range, often within small arms distance of enemy positions. Japanese defenders, recognizing their threat, concentrated fire against them whenever possible. Even a disabled track could leave a flamethrower tank exposed, forcing its crew to abandon the vehicle under fire. The turning point came during an operation against a ridge complex in the northern portion of the island. The ridge contained multiple interconnected caves that had resisted repeated assaults over several days. Infantry units attempting to advance along its base had been halted repeatedly by interlocking fire from concealed positions. Artillery preparation had limited effect, and a previous tank-supported assault had resulted in 2 disabled vehicles and significant casualties. Faced with these conditions, the local infantry commander requested sustained flamethrower support rather than another piecemeal attempt. This request went beyond earlier practice. Instead of using the flamethrower tank to address a single identified cave, the plan called for systematic engagement of the entire ridge face, targeting suspected tunnel entrances in sequence. There was no standing doctrine that explicitly authorized such employment. The decision was made at the company and platoon level based on accumulated experience rather than formal instruction. The platoon leader agreed to commit the flamethrower tank in a more sustained role, provided infantry could offer close protection and engineers were prepared to follow up by sealing entrances. The operation began under limited visibility, with smoke used to obscure the tank's approach. Infantry units advanced in parallel, marking suspected cave openings with colored panels and hand signals. The flamethrower tank moved slowly along the ridge base, stopping at each indicated point to deliver controlled bursts into openings and fissures. Unlike earlier engagements, the flame was applied repeatedly and deliberately. After an initial burst, the tank remained in position long enough to deliver additional fire, rather than withdrawing immediately. Engineers followed closely, placing demolition charges once the immediate threat had been reduced. Infantry secured the perimeter, engaging any defenders attempting to emerge from secondary exits. Japanese resistance during this operation differed from previous encounters. Instead of brief exchanges followed by reoccupation, several positions fell silent after sustained flame application. In some cases, defenders attempted to flee through secondary tunnels and were intercepted. In others, no further movement was detected. The risks were evident throughout. The flamethrower tank drew concentrated fire, including mortar rounds that landed nearby and small arms fire directed at exposed infantry. At one point, the tank's advance was halted when ash collapsed beneath its tracks, forcing a brief pause while engineers stabilized the ground. The crew remained inside the vehicle during this period, aware that they were stationary and vulnerable. Despite these dangers, the operation achieved results that had not been seen in previous attempts. By the end of the day, the ridge complex was largely inactive. Subsequent patrols encountered minimal resistance, and no significant reoccupation was reported over the following days. Casualty figures for the infantry units involved were lower than in earlier assaults on similar terrain. These outcomes did not go unnoticed. Reports from the operation were forwarded through battalion channels, emphasizing the coordinated use of flamethrower tanks, infantry, and engineers. While the language remained cautious and factual, the implication was clear. Sustained and systematic flame employment offered a practical solution to entrenched defenses that had resisted other methods. Japanese command elements also took note. Survivors from the ridge complex reported conditions inside the tunnels during flame attacks that differed from shelling or small arms fire. Heat and smoke penetrated deeper than expected, making prolonged occupation difficult. Oxygen depletion forced withdrawals that could not always be executed in an orderly manner. While defenders remained committed to resistance, the psychological and physical toll of these attacks was evident. For the platoon leader, the operation marked a shift in responsibility. He was no longer merely responding to requests, but actively advising on planning and execution. This increased his exposure to risk, as his presence was often required near the front lines to coordinate movements and adjust tactics in real time. It also placed him in a position that diverged from established norms. The expanded use of flamethrower tanks had not yet been formally endorsed at higher levels. While immediate commanders supported the results, broader acceptance remained uncertain. There was an implicit understanding that success in the field would determine whether these methods were adopted more widely. As February ended and March began, similar operations were planned in other sectors. Flamethrower tanks were assigned more frequently and with clearer objectives. Infantry units adjusted their expectations, relying less on repeated frontal assaults and more on coordinated reduction of fortified areas. The turning point was not a single directive or dramatic event. It was a gradual realization, driven by necessity, that existing methods were insufficient and that adaptation carried risks but also offered tangible gains. For those directly involved, the change was measured in fewer stalled advances and, in some cases, fewer losses. Yet the increased reliance on flamethrower tanks meant that their crews would be called upon more often and under more dangerous conditions. The balance between effectiveness and vulnerability remained unresolved, setting the stage for further consequences as the battle continued.
As March 1945 progressed, the intensified use of flamethrower tanks altered the tempo of operations on Iwo Jima, but it also exposed new tensions within the American command structure. What had begun as a field-level adaptation now required coordination, approval, and resource prioritization at higher levels. The consequences of earlier decisions, made under pressure and without formal doctrinal backing, became increasingly visible. Flamethrower tanks were now in constant demand. Infantry regiments operating against the northern and central defensive belts submitted repeated requests for their support. The reduction of complex cave systems along ridges such as Motoyama Plateau and the approaches toward the island's northern end demonstrated that flame, when used systematically, could deny terrain more effectively than shell fire alone.
These results, however, came at a cost. The limited number of flamethrower tanks available meant that crews were often redeployed with minimal rest. Maintenance cycles were compressed. Fuel consumption increased sharply, requiring careful logistical planning to ensure pressurized flame fuel was available near the front lines. Any delay in resupply risked leaving infantry units without the support they had come to rely upon. Within the 4th Marine Tank Battalion, officers began to voice concerns about sustainability. Flamethrower tanks were not only vulnerable to enemy fire, but also prone to mechanical failure under constant use. Pressurization systems required precise calibration, and even minor damage could render the flame projector inoperable. Unlike standard Shermans, these vehicles could not easily substitute their primary weapon if the flamethrower system failed. Higher headquarters took notice of casualty and loss reports. While flamethrower tanks contributed to reduced infantry losses in certain engagements, their own vulnerability raised questions. A disabled flamethrower tank posed unique dangers. If hit in the fuel system, the vehicle risked internal fire, though catastrophic explosions were less common than feared. Nevertheless, the perception of risk influenced command attitudes. Some senior officers questioned whether the expanded use of flamethrower tanks aligned with established combined arms doctrine. Traditional doctrine emphasized artillery preparation, followed by infantry advance supported by armor. Flame weapons had been intended as niche tools, not primary means of reduction. The emerging reality on Iwo Jima challenged these assumptions, creating friction between formal planning and battlefield adaptation. The platoon leader who had overseen early sustained flame operations found himself navigating this tension directly. His after-action reports were factual and restrained, detailing conditions, coordination requirements, and observed outcomes. He avoided advocacy language, yet the implications of his reports were clear. Positions subjected to deliberate flame attacks were less likely to re-engage. Infantry units supported in this manner advanced with fewer casualties and required fewer repeated assaults. At the same time, he documented the strain on crews. Flamethrower operators worked under constant threat, aware that their vehicle drew disproportionate enemy attention. Prolonged exposure to heat, fumes, and combat stress affected performance. Crew fatigue increased the risk of error, whether in navigation, coordination, or equipment handling. Japanese defenders continued to resist with discipline, but their situation deteriorated. Tunnel systems damaged by repeated flame attacks became increasingly difficult to inhabit. Smoke and heat lingered longer in deeper sections. Supplies stored underground were destroyed or rendered unusable. Communication between isolated units broke down as passages collapsed or became impassable. Despite these pressures, Japanese doctrine did not fundamentally change. Kuribayashi's orders still emphasized endurance and denial rather than counterattack. Flamethrower tanks were engaged whenever possible, but the defenders lacked sufficient anti-armor resources to neutralize them consistently. As a result, some positions were abandoned not because of direct destruction, but because they could no longer be sustained. The consequences of intensified flame use extended beyond immediate tactical effects. Engineers reported that areas cleared in this manner required less follow-on demolition. Infantry patrols encountered fewer surprise reoccupations. These outcomes reinforced the perception among frontline units that flamethrower tanks, while dangerous to employ, reduced overall exposure to prolonged combat in fortified zones. However, this practical success did not eliminate institutional hesitation. Requests for additional flamethrower tanks could not be met quickly. Converting standard Shermans required time and resources unavailable during the ongoing battle. Commanders were forced to prioritize sectors, deciding where flame support would be allocated and where units would continue to rely on conventional means. These decisions carried weight. Units assigned flamethrower support advanced more steadily, while others faced continued attritional fighting. The uneven distribution of this capability contributed to disparities in progress and casualty rates across the island. Such outcomes fueled debate among officers, some of whom questioned whether earlier formal endorsement might have reduced losses. For the platoon leader, the stakes became increasingly personal. His role expanded to include advising multiple infantry units, often requiring him to be forward of his original command position. Each engagement carried the risk of vehicle loss or crew injury, yet withdrawal from this role would leave infantry units without experienced coordination, increasing their vulnerability. By mid-March, organized Japanese resistance was confined largely to the northern end of the island. Even there, cave complexes remained formidable. Flamethrower tanks continued to be used selectively, their employment now more structured but still reliant on local judgment rather than comprehensive doctrine. The battle's later stages highlighted the dual nature of adaptation. On one hand, field-level decisions had produced tangible gains. On the other, these gains exposed gaps in planning, equipment allocation, and doctrinal flexibility. The consequences of earlier unofficial adjustments were now inseparable from the broader conduct of the operation. As operations pushed toward the island's final defensive zones, the question was no longer whether flamethrower tanks were effective, but how their use would be understood, regulated, and remembered once the fighting ended. The answer would shape both immediate outcomes and future institutional responses.
By late March 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima had largely collapsed, though isolated fighting continued in scattered caves and tunnels. On 26 March, American commanders officially declared the island secured, even as patrols and engineer teams remained engaged in clearing remaining underground positions. The battle had lasted 36 days, far longer than initial estimates, and had produced casualty figures that forced a sober reassessment of assumptions held before the landing. In the final phase of operations, flamethrower tanks were employed in a more controlled and deliberate manner. Their use was no longer experimental nor entirely improvised. Field experience had produced informal standards. Infantry protection was mandatory, engineer follow-up was essential, and flame application had to be sustained rather than cursory. While no comprehensive doctrine was issued during the battle itself, these practices became widely accepted among units that had worked alongside the vehicles. The platoon leader who had overseen early sustained flame operations continued his duties through the final days of fighting. By this stage, his role was less about innovation and more about execution under established patterns. The flamethrower tank crews operated with practiced coordination, aware of both the effectiveness and the limits of their equipment. Engagements were fewer but no less deliberate, as remaining defenders were often deeply entrenched and unwilling to surrender. Japanese soldiers who survived these final engagements left accounts that reflected the cumulative toll of flame-based attacks. While shelling and bombing were destructive, flame had altered the habitability of the underground defenses on which their strategy depended. Tunnel systems designed to withstand blast and fragmentation proved less resilient to sustained heat and smoke. In many cases, defenders withdrew not because their positions were physically destroyed, but because they could no longer be occupied safely or effectively. From the American perspective, the conclusion of the battle prompted immediate analysis. After-action reports compiled by Marine units emphasized the challenges posed by fortified subterranean defenses and the inadequacy of conventional firepower alone. Flamethrower tanks were cited repeatedly as effective tools when properly employed, though reports also noted their vulnerability, logistical demands, and psychological strain on crews. At higher levels, these findings influenced post-battle evaluations. The use of armored flamethrowers was no longer regarded as a marginal capability. While still recognized as specialized, they were acknowledged as essential in certain operational environments, particularly against well-prepared defensive systems. The experience on Iwo Jima contributed to revisions in training, equipment planning, and tactical manuals in the months that followed, though such changes were incremental rather than sweeping. For the individuals involved, the aftermath was quieter.
Flamethrower tank crews returned to routine duties, equipment maintenance, and eventually redeployment or demobilization. Their work received limited public attention. Official narratives of the battle focused on the broader campaign, iconic imagery, and overall strategic outcomes rather than the specific means by which entrenched positions were reduced. The platoon leader who submitted his final reports without commentary beyond operational detail. His observations became part of the institutional record, informing future planning without personal attribution. Like many adaptations made under combat conditions, the decisions taken on Iwo Jima were absorbed into doctrine without formal acknowledgement of their origins at the platoon and company level. In the years after the war, historians and military analysts revisited the battle to understand why it unfolded as it did. The role of flamethrower tanks was recognized as significant, but often treated as a technical footnote rather than a central factor. Yet within professional military study, their employment stood as an example of how field-level adaptation addressed gaps between expectation and reality. The Japanese defenders of Iwo Jima were ultimately overwhelmed, not by a single weapon or tactic, but by sustained pressure applied across multiple domains. Flamethrower tanks did not determine the outcome alone, but they addressed a specific operational problem that other methods could not resolve efficiently. Their impact lay in enabling progress where resistance might otherwise have continued indefinitely. The legacy of these vehicles and the crews who operated them remains understated. They worked at close range, under persistent threat, performing tasks that were technically demanding and psychologically taxing. Their contribution was measured not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in reduced reoccupation of cleared ground and fewer repeated assaults against the same positions. Iwo Jima stands as a case study in the limits of pre-war planning and the necessity of adaptation. The integration of flamethrower tanks into the battle was not the result of a single directive or innovation, but of accumulated experience under pressure. It was a response shaped by terrain, enemy doctrine, and the practical needs of infantry engaged in prolonged close combat. If you value historically grounded accounts that examine how overlooked tools and individuals shaped real outcomes, consider subscribing for more documented World War II stories.